the blessings of God be upon you all. Thank you and welcome for attending this session. This session will be devoted to what journalists have been suffering in this current aggression on Gaza. Without them, we wouldn't have known what is happening. Many have sacrificed their lives, in fact. Journalists, reporters, cameramen, and other members of the profession. Their sacrifices have been painful indeed and grave indeed. But we have with us two of our colleagues, Wael al-Dahdouh and Ismail Abu Umar. Welcome both of you, and then we will invite our other panelist, Ms. Khadija Patel, the chairperson of the IPI. She will be joining us in a few minutes. Mr. Umar Al-Farouq Uthman, who is the president of the JIF, and Muhammad Al-Raji, from our colleague from Al Jazeera Research Center. On one of my visits to Palestine, I stood in the middle of the city of Jaffa. I was talking about the anniversary of the Nakba and all the crimes that Israel has perpetrated to get rid of the Palestinian population and replace them. I said to my colleague Walid Al-Umar, who was standing next to me, isn't it strange that we can stand here and say all these things and nobody dares to harm us? He said to me, that's right, but don't be deluded. You can say what you like, but if one day or 1 second you were perceived as constituting a threat against these people, they'll have no mercy on you. At that time, I thought of all the possible nightmares I could imagine from the words of our colleague Walid, but I never imagined that journalists will be targeted physically, personally, and their families. So, first we'll have a package of about 10 minutes. Our colleague Nabil Al-Rihani, and by the way, he is one of the producers of, with Amir Siddiq, they produce the program Gaza, What Next, which is the daily program on Al Jazeera. If happened, who are neighborhoods where this minimum, it is the, what is it? That the truth, nearly 35,000 people were. The number has been what it has been doing, regarded in the first accused of deliberate Gaza and the harassment which has reached was where yet an Israeli sniper. If that was what happened, no hospitals or for people. The war on Gaza, he journalist says journalists were experienced many such cases. No, the journalists be treated as such to land on them. CC and the IC and the International Arab Protection for Humanity, and the truth has a price to pay, and this killing, which goes regardless of all attempts at accountability, in total impunity, is not going to stop the journalists from doing their jobs. Although the Israeli political and military leaders have been ignoring these crimes, but even they now are worried that warrants will be issued by the ICC to arrest them, and this makes the journalists feel that their sacrifices were not in vain. May God have mercy and rest the souls of all our dead colleagues and a speedy recovery for all the ones who are still in hospitals waiting treatment. وائل الدحدوح and Ismail Abu Umar, who we have met before, but this time I will not play the role of the presenter. This will not be important, but I will allow them to speak to you directly and tell us what happened. Wael. Thank you, dear Muhammad.
من العمل الميداني. ولكن هذه المرة الصحفي الفلسطيني وكل صحفي قام بتغطية هذه الحرب شعر بأنه يقوم بالتغطية من عين الموت ومن بطن الموت. هذا شعور لم يسكننا من قبل حقيقة. وأنا قمت وكثير من زملائي بتغطية جميع الحروب وعمليات التصعيد والحصار والعمليات العسكرية الإسرائيلية على قطاع غزة. لم نشعر قط بمثل هذا الشعور الذي كان يسكننا ويخيم علينا في كل لحظة من لحظات التغطية في الحرب الإسرائيلية على قطاع غزة التي ما زالت مستمرة. لكن هذه المرة
because it's different than all the previous wars, maybe the Israeli occupation forces wanted to be different from the point of view of the amount of pain and suffering it was inflicting on Palestinian journalists in Gaza. They wanted to make us suffer through our willpower, our mental and psychological health. In what happened to me and my colleagues, we were every time we heard a plane, a drone, a rocket, or a bullet that it can target us physically, but this time it was different. They began to target our family members. Maybe this was even more painful than targeting us anyway. This kind of suffering, this kind of pain did not make us less resolute in wanting to do our job, less steadfast, because right from the very first moment we realized that this is different, this war is different, and therefore our role should be different and should be distinguishable from other previous conflicts, and the role of the Palestinian journalists should be different. This is what we tried to do, but the Israeli occupation forces did not leave it there. The Israeli targeting this time was more comprehensive, and they did not leave anything without targeting it. Of course, killing is at the top of targeting, but the Palestinian journalists were suffering in a multiple way. We lost our wives, our sisters, our brothers, our children, our grandchildren. We lost our homes. We were starved. The Israeli forces selected houses. Without any doubt, they chose to target these houses because they belonged to certain journalists, and also the offices of Al Jazeera and other news organizations. And the Israeli forces forced the journalists to leave their areas under the pressure of bombardment and firepower. They asked them to leave the city of Gaza to the northern and southern parts, and they were not even safe there. And similarly to what Nabil has said in the package, these areas became death traps for the Palestinian journalists and the Palestinian population, and all of these acts amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. When we tried to shed light on what was happening and to make sure that images in Khan Yunis, the mission I was carrying out with my late colleague Samer, we notified the Israeli army. They gave us their approval through the International Red Cross, and therefore, based on this approval, of course, deep down we were never sure that they will stick to the word. But then we thought their approval came through an international organization, which is the Red Cross, and that's why we went to Khan Yunis, and you can imagine every few yards the ambulance we were using to get there and they target us using one missile at least, which shredded the ambulance crew, and I fell unconscious for a while. Then I regained my consciousness. I tried to stand to move from the area because I knew they normally target us with two successive missiles. I wanted to avoid the second one. When I regained consciousness, I realized that I was bleeding heavily, And when I realized that this bleeding was very strong, I said that the bleeding will kill me instead of the second missile. Therefore, I decided to use my right of hanging on to the only glimmer of hope, and that is to press on the wound and try and make my way to the ambulance, which was about 800 meters away, although deep down I could not believe myself that I'll survive and I'll make it, and more maybe I said to myself, this is your end, Abu Hamza. But I decided to take my chances. I said, even if I don't make it to the ambulance, at least I honor myself by giving it a go and trying. Of course, I made it to the ambulance, but and also they thought that they will be targeted, and we started then tried to help Samir Abu Daqqa. He was bleeding heavily, and the Israelis kept on dragging their feet and not cooperating after 5 to 6 hours until they gave their approval. And when the ambulance entered the area, they could only bring Samir back after his death, and we found that Samir took off the bulletproof jacket that journalists wear to lessen his weight to crawl, but it seems that they knew what he was doing. They insisted on targeting him again and destroying the camera to destroy the film he has taken, and only then they allowed the Palestinian ambulance to come to his aid, but it was only too late. Not only that, many journalists suffered even worse attacks, but what was even more painful than the targeting themselves is the silence by international organizations, international journalist organizations, all wars with no exception that we heard about and we received information on. It has never been the case that this number of journalists have been targeted and killed in the longest of all wars. Yet, the immediately concerned international organizations kept silent or almost silent, and for us as journalists and as victims of the Israeli targeting was even more painful than being targeted physically. And also the double standards, and especially by some news organizations which allowed themselves for tens of years that they are the masters of human rights and freedom of the expressions, yet their failure was resounding in this war, which we call the revealing war or the exposing war.
Thank you very much, Wael. We'd like to give the floor now to Ismail Abu Omar. Thank you very much. May the peace of God be upon you. In my intervention is going to be very brief. I can't say more than what Abu Hamza had just said. So I would like to start where Abu Hamza ended and talk about the crimes that have been committed against our journalists. We have 147 journalists that have died and have become martyrs as a result of this war. So there are 20 of those journalists whose names have been announced. And also, I would like to talk about my own personal experience in the operation in which I was targeted by the occupation forces. But before I start talking about this operation, I would like to talk about the different human rights agencies that contribute to the distortion of the facts. These agencies are supposed to protect journalists on the ground, but those rules, those laws have not been implemented, unfortunately. This is a distortion of history, and there's going to be a generation that will know that these international agencies have falsified the facts, and the generation will know that those rights were not protected and maintained when it comes to journalists. With regard to the incidents that happened while I was directly targeted by the occupation forces and all the dangers that we have gone through, I have been targeted and I was targeted on the 130th day of the war. Myself and my friend Matar, I wish him a speedy recovery. This is my supplication to Allah for him to enjoy a recovery as speedy as possible. I was in a camp, and my wife was in a different camp in Rafah. My brothers or siblings were in a different camp closer to Khan Yunis. I slept in one of the camps and I woke up to find myself in a different camp with my sister where we had our breakfast. And after that, I moved to a third camp to meet my third sister to use my motorbike for me to be able to go to where I'm supposed to work. Ahmed was in Rafah and he would move once he receives a call from me. So we're talking about a region which is in the southern part of Khan Yunis, which was the area that was targeted by so many operations carried out by the occupation forces. So I moved to that area and I met with my colleague Ahmed Matar, and a number of incidents started taking place, so bombardments, and we have documented some of the targetings that took place, and we send them and share them with Al Jazeera network and other outlets. So it was very, very difficult to follow all these incidents that have happened. So from 8 a.m. until 1 p.m., we have been covering the incidents happening on Al Jazeera network in order to monitor what is happening in Khan Yunis after each and every hour. So there was a bombardment in the area where I was following and covering the events. A number of citizens have been targeted in those areas. It was a direct targeting of a number of people, and there was a young man who fell martyr as a result of the bombardment, and we documented that particular incident. We took a decision, Ahmed and I, to leave that area because it was a very risky area because of the reconnaissance aircrafts that were in that area, and we decided to go to the European Gaza hospital in the area of Khan Yunis because that area has internet service, so it was the best place to go to as opposed to other areas where we did not have enough coverage. So we took the decision, and after that, Al Jazeera asked us to come out with a last minute message from that area. They didn't know that that area was targeted, and I said I'm going to talk about the bombardment in the coming bulletin. And indeed, this is what had happened. And I went out on Al Jazeera and I delivered the message. Everybody saw the scene when I was looking at the sky before going live and before moving to the European Gaza hospital. I prepared my belongings We prepared our tools and pieces of equipment to leave the area, to go to the hospital. So there were many reconnaissance aircrafts. So we talked about the bombardments and also the targeting that happened in Khan Yunis. After the end of the coverage, I was wearing my bulletproof vest in addition to my helmet. I removed my helmet after I finished and I put it on my motorbike because we resorted to motorbikes in those areas. These areas are not very dangerous. There are no occupation vehicles, but we have aircrafts covering the skies. So we took and we started riding our motorbikes, and Ahmed was behind me in a different motorbike, and Ahmed tried to speed up in order to get closer to me, and we were parallel to each other, and he was trying to get closer to me in order for us to start talking to each other, talking about a particular subject. When Ahmed got close to me, he was only able to utter two words. There was a small moment that separated between us and death. So when he uttered those two words, the bombardment started. At that particular moment, there was a missile launched by the reconnaissance aircrafts targeting us directly. In that place, there are no people except a few people walking around in addition to cars. The first bombardment started. I was still conscious then, and I realized that I lost my lower extremity, one of my lower extremities. I started looking at myself, and people started getting closer to me, tried to help us and to take us to a nearby hospital. I was face down and I was trying to be reassured about the situation that Ahmed undergoes. So I tried as much as I can to go on my back to see the scene around me very clearly. So it was a painful thing, but I was able to move and be and lay down on my back. So Ahmed was conscious still, and his subdued a head injury, a shoulder injury, and also he was injured in his feet. So people started surrounding us, and we were lucky enough because there was a field hospital that was close to the area where we were directly targeted. I was taken from the place where I was through a civilian vehicle. Can you imagine? These are civilians that are so enthusiastic. They want to take you to a civilian car or vehicle, a vehicle that has no paramedic services or treatment services. So they carry you with all their strength. They try to help you. They try to go as fast as possible to take you to hospital. So they put you in the trunk of the car and the driver drives very fast. You can imagine, and the streets of Gaza, everybody knows the streets of Gaza, or can imagine at least the streets of Gaza. Abu Hamza knows that. So it was very difficult indeed. So when you try to move, it was very difficult. I was still conscious then until I reached the hospital, which is the International Medical Authority Hospital, and then I lost consciousness due to the level of bleeding that I subdued. So after being treated very quickly, I was taken to the European Gaza hospital, where a number of medical procedures were undertaken until I reached a phase that was to some extent stable. Sometimes I am stable, sometimes I was stable, sometimes my situation deteriorated as a result of the heavy bleeding. And now I'm here standing before you and I apologize that I am sitting the way I am here. Do forgive me for the way I look here. I was fated to look like this. I was fated to be like this. So God's blessings and mercy made me stay alive. And may Allah Almighty grant you the possibility and the ability to deliver the words of truth. And we hope that we were able to do our job adequately and doing a service to our people in Gaza. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ismail. Ismail cannot stay with us for too long. He's going to leave us, and in the meantime, we're going to invite our other guests to join us. I would like to invite each one of them to come forward. Mrs. Khadija Batil from IPI. I would like to invite and welcome the panelists. So I was very lenient with time with both Wael al-Dahdouh and Ismail, but this is not going to apply to the remaining guests, so they have to abide by the time allocated. But before that, we're going to listen to a recorded intervention by Irina Khan, who is the special rapporteur, UN special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right of freedom of opinion and expression.
Any civilian, including journalists. The courage and commitment of journalists like Wael Dadu have been deeply inspiring for all of us. Without the commitment of journalists like him, of local journalists in Gaza on the ground, the world would not know today the truth about the humanitarian crisis, the enormous starvation and suffering of civilians, the war crimes, the unfolding genocide. Journalists are bringing those stories to the rest of the world, but at a great price to them. And we must value the reporting of local journalists in a situation where international outlets have not been given access and where live streaming is now being restricted under the recent foreign media law by Israel. Killing a journalist anywhere in the world is the most egregious form of censorship. Furthermore, in 9 out of 10 cases of the murder of journalists, there is impunity. That means no investigation, prosecution, or punishment of the perpetrators. In Palestine, setting aside the situation in Gaza, about 40 journalists have been killed in the last 30 years, and not a single case has led to an independent investigation or prosecution. So there it is not 9 out of 10, it is 10 out of 10. Remember, Abu Akleh's case is still pending any justice. No independent investigation has taken place. When impunity prevails, there is no justice for the victims or their families. But impunity also has another effect. It emboldens the perpetrators. Killing journalists kills this individual, but it also chills many others by intimidating and silencing them. And journalists are killed not only while reporting from the front lines, but also in peaceful situations. For example, when they're chasing a story on corruption, or when they're investigating organized crime. Murder is the worst threat that journalists face today. But I would also like to discuss a few other kinds of threats that are endangering journalists. Let me mention digital threats. Many women journalists are subject of online threats, including death and rape threats that can be very intimidating and can sometimes lead to violence offline. Targeted electronic surveillance is used in a number of countries to also intimidate and silence investigative journalists. Then there are legal threats. Increasingly, national security laws, counterterrorism laws, fake news laws, and criminal libel laws are being used to threaten, prosecute, and imprison journalists. On the one hand, the law does not provide justice to journalists who are killed or attacked. On the other hand, the legal system is weaponized to prosecute and punish journalists for doing their work. Journalism is not a crime, yet journalists are increasingly being charged, prosecuted, and jailed under criminal law. Killing a journalist is a crime. That is the slogan of your upcoming campaign. I congratulate you on that, but I would add to that another line. Journalism is not a crime. Journalists must not be treated as criminals. I also want to mention another trend that is a threat against the safety of journalists, and that is the increasing use of disinformation to discredit independent, critical journalism. In an increasing number of countries, governments and political leaders are deliberately fueling hatred and public distrust against journalists, insulting, discrediting, threatening independent media who dare to criticize the government. Think of the campaign that has been launched by Israel to discredit Al Jazeera on its reporting on the Palestinian occupied territories. But Al Jazeera is not the only media outlet that is being attacked, nor is Israel the only government using such tactics. And this is a very dangerous tactic because it is about discrediting media, independent media, in the eyes of the public. And consider the fact that this is the year of elections. In all regions of the world, upcoming elections portend very strong pressure and likelihood of attacks on journalists. So today, around the world, media freedom and the safety of journalists are under enormous pressure, both in totalitarian states, which have always been intolerant of independent journalism, but sadly, increasingly in many what I call backsliding democracies, countries that have democratic institutions, but where authoritarian trends are rising, state institutions such as courts and the legal system are being captured by the ruling party, media independence is being threatened, and laws are being used to clamp down on freedom of expression. As far back as 2015, the United Nations Security Council adopted a resolution number 2222 on the safety of journalists, affirming a free media as a foundation of democratic society and journalists as civilians who must be respected and protected under international law. But today, when journalists are being targeted in Gaza or Ukraine or many other places around the world, those same members of the UN Security Council are turning a blind eye. And we must change that situation. And I believe it can be done through pressure and through various measures. In my own reports, I have suggested a number of steps, some of which I want to mention to you here, so that you can make it part of your campaign and you can push for them. First of all, impunity for the killing of journalists must end. The International Criminal Court prosecutor must act. And we have now seen the International Criminal Court prosecutor demand warrants for some Israeli leaders and for the Hamas. The ICC must do so more systematically whenever journalists are killed in conflict situations. Outside the ICC, there must be renewed effort made by the international community to strengthen independent mechanisms for investigation of killings of journalists. Secondly, the United Nations Human Rights Mechanism should probe more thoroughly what actions member states are taking to investigate killings and attacks against journalists in their own countries. Thirdly, at the national level, defamation must be decriminalized. No journalist must be targeted as a criminal and prosecuted under criminal law for doing his or her job. And fourthly, targeted digital surveillance should be prohibited without independent judicial oversight. And an international moratorium should be placed on the same trade use of spyware like Pegasus that is being used against journalists, human rights defenders, and others. But most importantly, civil society and media outlets must work together to raise awareness, name and shame those countries where journalists are being killed with impunity and where political leaders are using the bully pulpit to attack journalists. It is only through public pressure, it is only through public awareness, and it is only through a partnership of civil society and journalists that we can create that political will, that political pressure on governments to ensure that journalists are protected. Because if we fail to protect journalists, then we actually threaten peace, security, democracy, and human rights. I congratulate you once again for what you're doing to raise awareness, and I would like to wish you and your future campaign all the very best, and I look forward to supporting your efforts. Thank you.
شكرا للسيدة إيرين خان. الآن نشرع في الاستماع للسادة المتداخلين هنا على المنصة في حدود 10 دقائق لو تكرمتم لكل مداخلة، والبداية مع السيدة خديجة بثيل. تفضلي.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Al Jazeera for hosting these important conversations. But I think that this is a moment as well to affirm the courage of the journalism that Al Jazeera has been doing over the last few months. Under immense pressure from around the world, and at great cost, personal cost to its journalists, Al Jazeera has been unflinching, and I think for that it must be applauded. And on behalf of the International Press Institute, we want to commend Al Jazeera for its courage and really for showing us the value of quality journalism as a transformative tool for society. But we want to say as well that we've been alarmed, I think, by the lack of response, by the sheer number of journalists that have been killed, the number of journalists who have been targeted. But also I think that for many of us as journalists living around the world, it has also been rather jarring to face many questions about why there should be even an outrage. Because at the heart of this, often what we find is an asymmetry in the value of life. And that comes to the fore, especially when we work with Gaza. But I think that for journalists, it affirms to us as well why we have to ensure that we communicate that an attack on journalists anywhere is not just an attack on this profession. So when a journalist is killed, targeted, their families targeted in Gaza, whether it is an Al Jazeera journalist, this is not just an Al Jazeera problem. It is not just a Palestinian people's problem. It is not just an Arab problem, but rather this is a problem that humanity must resolve, because journalists represent our ability to understand the world. They represent our ability to understand the truth. And when that is being attacked, when that is being thwarted, then our very human rights are being violated. And it's not just the human rights of the people within that society, but rather this is a global problem. That is why an attack on a journalist anywhere is an attack on people everywhere. And that, I think, is what is essential to be understood. That this is not an Al Jazeera problem. It is not a Gaza problem. It is not a Palestine problem. This is a problem that portends a greater crisis for human rights and indeed for the prosperity of human beings. This is something essential that has to be resolved. So we've come out of our World Congress as the International Press Institute last week, where we have called on international society to do more to stop the killings of journalists. But I think that what we find is essential also is solidarity and the value of solidarity, and ensuring that, first of all journalists around the world understand what is happening, and that we're able to, as well, to ensure that even in situations where the flow of information is being thwarted, that we are doing more to ensure that it does get out. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا لك سيدة خديجة. أحيل الكلمة الآن للسيد عمر الفاروق فليتفضل. شكرا سيدة خديجة على الاختصار. شكرا.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And in fact, it's really very disturbing to witness the testimonies provided by our two colleagues here, Ismail and Wael, listening them. And for us, it's not strange, especially coming from Somalia, where many journalists were killed, and being the deadliest country for journalists in Africa for many years. But then the horrifying testimonies provided by colleagues, it's really very difficult sometimes to talk about as journalists. But I want to say, on behalf of African journalists, from Cape to Cairo, we want to extend the solidarity to our brothers and sisters in Gaza, in Palestine, and those working for Al Jazeera. You are doing a marvelous job. a brilliant work for telling the truth, and that truth has become a serious victim and a casualty when it comes to practicing quality journalism that unearths the atrocities and the abuses that have been happening in different parties of Palestine, in terms of in Gaza and in West Bank. But that said, for us as a movement of journalists, we believe an injury to one is an injury to all. What happened to Brother Dahdouh here, Brother Ismail here, and many other colleagues working for Al Jazeera is an attack to all of us. It doesn't matter if you are living in Africa or working in Africa, or you are in Gaza, or you are somewhere in Latin America or in Asia. This is an organized crime committed against journalists because a notorious politician wants to hide the truth and the atrocities that's being committed. And for us, last week, we were in Accra, Ghana, and we were discussing about the safety crisis that journalists face, be they physical safety or legal safety that journalists face. And that is what the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression was just talking about, the question of legal safety and the weaponization of draconian laws and the judiciary to attack and oppress journalists. But what we are seeing is now, not the issue that we usually see, journalists being killed and the flourishing culture of impunity. We see it, this is beyond what's happening in Gaza. The perseverance, the resilience of the Palestinian journalists to hold the line, tell the truth, and practice their chosen profession. Indeed, it's a noble profession that they have chosen. It's something beyond the commendation. It has passed all the lines of bravery. Working in the streets of Mogadishu, where Al-Shabaab is chasing us one after the other, paying us through the bullets. That was horrifying to us. But what I have listened from my brothers here who have just spoken ahead of us here, this is extremely, a moving situation. But colleagues, I think for us as journalists, what we need to talk about is how do we go beyond the normal things that appeal is, condemnation is, statement is, and government is that sometimes come out to say we stand with press freedom. We stand with independent practice of journalism. We support quality journalism. We need to go beyond this. And how do we make sure in a meaningful way the safety and security of journalists, especially now that we are beyond the talk of impunity, that war crime is being committed as we sit here and as we talk here, and journalists are on the front line in terms of this war crime that's being committed. So we need to set a new way of finding to protect journalists. And thanks to Al Jazeera, to its Director General, Dr. Mustafa here, and all other colleagues for providing this platform at this crucial time where we have to find a new way to protect journalists. The old system that we knew is no longer working. What have we seen? The names, the faces on this screen of our colleagues who have perished in Gaza, brutally murdered. But then their faces, their work should not be in vain. How do we tackle beyond this new way of protection? The normal way of doing business when it comes to the protection of journalists is no longer working. The international rule of law is not working. It's not protecting journalists. And it's glaringly on our face. It's not hidden. That is why many of us, we believe that there must be a new way to protect journalists, be they in conflict zones or in democratic governments, like Irene was saying, where there are obnoxious laws, draconian laws, judiciary is weaponized against journalists. That is way we have to find the protection. Thank you.
شكرا لك سيد عمر المختار. الكلمة النهائية للدكتور محمد دراجي.
شكرا.
تفضل.
شكرا جزيلا. أنا أطلب من الزملاء، أنا عندي بعض الشرائح اللي ممكن يعني من خلالها ممكن يكون تعليق. أطلب من الزملاء أن يظهروا الشرائح، مشكورين.
تفضل جاهز. انتظار الشرائح، اشرح انت.
اعتقد في مشكله ما بتمشيش يعني.
تفضل. لهذا انا اعادي البرزنتيشن.
لا مش مشكله، الحين اشتغلت.
لهذه الاسباب اكره البرزنتيشن في البانلز. تفضل يا سيدي.
ممكن يكون عندك مع اعداء شخصي، لكن احنا بالنسبه للباحثين مهم جدا يعني.
يلا سيدي تفضل.
انا اخترت العنوان كالاتي اللي هو الحرب على غزه والإبادة الإعلامية للجماعة الصحفية. وكما تلاحظون هو عنوان مركب من 3 مصطلحات مفتاحية اللي هي الحرب والإبادة الإعلامية والجماعة الصحفية. صحيح أن الاستهداف هو للإنسانية بشكل عام مثل ما ذكر الزملاء، أو على الإنسانية بشكل عام، لكن أعتقد أن جزء من الاستهداف هو للجماعة الصحفية أو الجسم الصحفي الفلسطيني. فكما تلاحظون هو الموضوع يعالج الحالة الاستثنائية والانتهاكات الجسيمة للصحفيين أو ما تعرض له صحفيون في غزة تحديدا. وهذا الاستهداف نحاول أن نبحث عن القصد أو القصد الذي تتجه إليه هذه الانتهاكات، وأيضا من ثم نبحث في كان من الملاحظ أنه في طريقة ممنهجة في استهداف الصحفيين. فالسؤال هنا لماذا لجأت إسرائيل إلى التدمير الممنهج للجسم الصحفي؟
We ask the question, why has Israel resorted to this systematic targeting
أعتقد أن الاغتيال الصحفيين إذا صح التعبير وليس فقط القتل
of journalists is not just killing them. This was a premeditated targeting, systematically executed. In my personal opinion, this was a doctrine in Israeli official policy starting from 1967 to 2023 before the Al-Aqsa flood. The number of journalists killed or targeted were 104. The last one of them was Shirin Abu Akleh and Ghafran Warasna. So targeting journalists, in fact, in this way was unprecedented, whether inside Palestine from 2008, 2009 till 2022. This was an unprecedented, even in other areas of conflict, whether in the Ukraine or elsewhere. In 7 months, from the 7th of October till the 29th of April, the number of journalists was 153, according to some organizations like Wafa Agency, the Palestinian Journal Syndicate, and the Shirin Watch or Monitoring. So every 23 hours, one journalist was killed, making up 13% of the total number of journalists in Gaza, or 5 out of the total of the Palestinian journalists. And we find here in this pie chart that the number of female and male journalists who were killed in 7 months, if we compare this exceptional case that Wael named it a moment different than any other moment, we find that in World War II, 69 were killed, like 6 per year. In Vietnam, 20 journalists were killed, 1 per year, and this gives us an indication that it's, it's, it's not just targeting. These were not specific targeting that happened as part and parcel of the ongoing fighting and war, but in Gaza it was different. The targeting seemed to be deliberate. Here we look at how the legal discourse was facing this phenomena. For Reporters Without Frontiers, they use the term massacre, and this term has some sort of connotations to the situations of genocide, but the legal term here does not want to say specifically genocide. Other organizations said that this was deliberate targeting of journalists, making the reader draw his or her own conclusions. Also, the deliberate killing of journalists. Here we come to the premeditation or intent. Each crime has an intent or a motive, as well as the physical act of killing itself. Frankly speaking, I try to bypass this legal terminology because it does not penetrate deeply enough into these phenomena and avoids revealing the truth. But in fact, what happened in Gaza was a media genocide. By that I mean a plan, as we will see in a short while. Time is running out fast for you. Maybe I will skip some slides. I noticed that during this media genocide, this was part and parcel of the context of genocide, which manifested itself in Gaza in different ways, culturally, socially, economically, religiously, as was Raphael Limkin talked about. I think they are waiting for you to give them a cue to move the slides for you. Can we get some help? Just raise your hand, maybe they will follow. You have 2 minutes left. So therefore, generally speaking, the concept of genocide, general genocide, indicates that there was a plan, a deliberate plan, because every action comes within or part of a plan, which was this genocide was not random. It was under supervision, either by the military or security or political organizations in Israel, and this organized action is also takes place in a number of circles. It takes the dimension of targeting the social aspect of journalism, the professional side of journalism, and the human side of journalism. So therefore, this tripartite system requires mechanisms and tools which are employed to target journalists at different stages. For example, sometimes a journalist would be targeted during their field work, like what happened to Ismail Abu Umar and Wa'il Dahduh and others, or they are targeted when they are with their families inside their homes. And this was the hardest thing for a journalist, to be killed when he is with his family, and for all of them to be killed together. And this is an attempt to kill generations of. When you kill the target of a journalist, then you are destroying future generations of journalists. One final observation: also, when the journalists are targeted, that most of the journalists who were killed were in their 20s, between 20s and 40s. These are the ones. This was aimed to stop the transfer of knowledge from one generation to another. Before we open the floor for questions, I think after the break there is a fourth session you should be informed about, and that is on the struggle that influencers go through to make sure that their narratives reach their audience.
So children have a priority here. So we have a child from Gaza. Go ahead. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. My name is Ramadan Abu Jazar from Gaza. I'm 9 years old. In my heart, I have 3 wounds. So I have the wound of my childhood that was nipped in the bud, and I have the wound of wars that are never treated and taken care of. This war has deprived me from being able to continue and further my studies. I was deprived from nice time I can spend with my children. I meet them in shelter homes, in queues for water, for bread, and oftentimes I read their names in lists of people who have martyred. And what is remaining is my dream, the remaining parts of my dream. I try to delineate the story of Palestine and Palestinian children through my drawings and my writings. This war tries to deprive me of my safety and security. I am honored that I have come here to take part in this amazing conference. I'm honored that I have met these great people and great figures, and with the help of God Almighty, as we have met here in Al Jazeera Forum, we will meet at the gates of the Aqsa Mosque. But I have a question. And all the children of Gaza and all the people in Gaza are asking this question. What more and how much more bombardment do the Arab nations need to see before they start acting? We have in excess of 40,000 martyrs. We have a genocide ongoing now in Gaza, and people are watching us and not doing anything. I just want to know, how many more days do you need for you to act? We're talking about 223 days. How many children should martyr before you act? How many homes should be bombarded before you act? How many journalists should be killed and families obliterated, completely obliterated from the civil registry, to understand, to feel what we're undergoing as children of Gaza? How many more things should happen before the Arab and Islamic nations become one nation? Stand with us to liberate Al-Aqsa Mosque. Isn't this the cause of all Arabs and Muslims, or is it our cause only? We have many people in the resistant groups. Freedom fighters have been exerting efforts to expel the Zionists, the enemy, from our country. We have journalists who go to areas where the enemy is. Nobody had the guts to go to those areas. Our journalists have exerted a lot of effort, carried out fearful acts, but they said we have to keep on reporting. Have they ever said we're going to stop here? No, they never said that. They kept on trying and trying to report, because this is our territory, our land. A paramedic tried as much as possible to treat the wounded, take care of the sick people. Citizens have been very, very patient. They did their best as much as possible. They rise from the rubble to help others. This is very difficult. They rise from the rubble, but they're still resolute. They never surrender. Yes, they're resolute. They continue with the help of God Almighty. One day, we'll see the whole world, all Muslims, will see them stand with the people of Palestine, with the people of Gaza, because what is happening is not normal at all. Journalists, children, citizens, paramedics, freedom fighters, civilians, all of these are obliterated. We should, all of us, the whole world, should stand up for this cause, because this is the cause of all Muslims and all Arabs. Allah Almighty said in the Holy Quran, God that was able to have the Prophet move from the Haram Mosque to the Aqsa Mosque, where all the areas around it is blessed territories. All of these areas are blessed. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. So these are the children of Gaza. We would not fear for their future. We would like to take the questions that have come to us from the different platforms. And after that, we're going to give you the opportunity to pose 3 questions, and we're going to give each panelist 1 minute each. Thank you very much, Mohammed Krishan. What extent journalists, Palestinian journalists, are resolute despite the challenges and the risks? This is a fundamental question, very important question. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead. sitting behind Sami Al-Haj. Thank you very much, Hafsa Al-Ragrag. To be a Palestinian journalist in Gaza, it means that you're going to be targeted and you're going to enter the job or the profession that is full of risks. We still hear the following expression: they are taking their revenge from our own children. You were reporting stories, you became the story. After the great podcast that you had through Athir, you are the symbol of resoluteness. Don't you think of documenting this human experience, suffering in the written word? Thank you. Thank you very much. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. So the question that remains is the Israeli occupation. Though they kill journalists because they publish the truth, do they kill journalists and children and prisoners in order for them to say and tell the world we have other standards of truth? Or are they above the truth? They kill journalists in order to justify and to defy all countries of the world, to tell the whole world that they are above the truth. The silence of the international institutions, I think, is not a silence. It is a real participation in this crime. We have to correct these concepts and make them clear. Go ahead. Go ahead. May the peace of God be upon you. This is the question. Khalid from Sudan, a journalist. Journalism is the profession whereby journalists report the truth. So how can we provide protection and safety for our journalists? Thank you. Thank you for being brief. One last question from the back of this hall. Yes, go ahead. This is the last question. And after that, we're going to give the opportunity to the panelists and the last intervention by Wa'il. My name is Dr. Ahmed Zohro from Gaza. I do not want to pose a question. I want to say a few words. First, I was born in a country and I lived in another country. I would like to tell you, those who have come from Gaza and those who live in Gaza, you are lucky. You're honored because you stayed, and I'm honored that I'm sitting with you here. Your comments, Mrs. Khadija, and then Mr. Omar. And we conclude with Wa'il. Go ahead.
Is protected. And I think that what must be emphasized, what must be called on, and what I will continue to call on is the grand hypocrisy that we see over and over again every time we hear of the targeting of a journalist in Gaza. We see this over and over again. It's something that must be questioned, but also it's something that, it's my message to the international journalism community again, that this cannot be condoned, that when a journalist is targeted anywhere, it is this is basically an attack on media freedom everywhere. It is an attack on human freedom everywhere. So again, I call on the international community to do more to protect journalists, to ensure that international journalists are allowed to enter Gaza, but also that there is action taken against the brazen targeting of journalists these last months. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا لك سيد عمر فاروق تفضل.
Yeah, what we all see, and then the discussion is from colleagues have been, or the question is they have posed is quite clear. The current order of the protection of journalists is not working for journalists. It's not protecting journalism. And that's why we have to find a new way to protect journalists. Talking about impunity, talking about, the killings of journalists not being investigated, that we have passed that point now. And that is why we need a new way to provide the protection of the safety of journalists. And because what our colleagues in Gaza have been going through, they continue to go through, is the global system for the protection of journalists has totally collapsed and failed. And with that failure, that's where we have to have an international order for the protection of journalists, be they from the United Nations, the investigations of the International Court of Justice, and even all our judiciary authorities, because it is no longer working. And when journalists are killed, one is too many. We are talking about over 100 journalists killed in Gaza. And that is why we have to find a new way of mechanism, and such kind of a platform is very important. That the conclusion to be, number one, the current system, the global system for the protection of journalists, whatever form or shape it is not protecting journalists. Journalists are no longer safe. Journalism is the most endangered profession in this world. Why? Because somebody does not want to see the truth unveiled. And that is why the global system is not working. There is too many people talking sweet and condoning what are the abuses that are happening. We need a new global order to protect the safety of journalists.
Thank you very much. دكتور راجي.
شكرا. للتفاعل مع سؤال الدكتور في الإعلام، هو مثل ما ذكرنا قبل قليل هو التدمير الممنهج للجسم.
This is a systematic destruction of journalism in order to destroy and obliterate the journalistic narrative. They want to obliterate it altogether. They do not want to have any accounts or narratives coming from Gaza. This is what I concluded from meetings I had with journalists. They do not want to have any pieces of evidence that would document the crimes committed by the occupation forces. And also they try to control the accounts that are presented by the journalists. Also they try to control global public opinion, what is delivered to the global public opinion. The last point. So Al Jazeera was a concern for the occupation. They did not want to have voices of journalists and symbols. That is why the targeting of journalists was not part of the circumstances of the war. It was a kind of a social component of this war.
Before we give the final word to Wael, our next session will be at 4 o'clock and it will be headed by Elia Gharbiya. I would like to thank all who expressed solidarity with us and of course we are thinking of documenting and archiving our experiences to be something, a legacy we hand over to our future generations. As for providing protection for journalists in view of the occupation, which is so criminal, so brutal, no way protection can be provided for journalists unless the entire world stand unified, and then the Israeli occupation feel that no longer they can have impunity. Then and only then the Israeli occupation will think twice, but not twice, maybe 1,000 times before targeting journalists, because then they will know they are protected by law. So therefore we can ask, for how long can Palestinian journalists remain resolute and steadfast? I think we have been covering this exceptional war, and in doing so we created a very inspiring model for us, for journalists, for our generations. This was not easy task. The cost for that was huge. We ourselves could not imagine that we'll pay this heavy price for formulating this model, but this is what has happened. It was not easy. It is never easy for a journalist to see his family, his loved ones, his neighbors, his friends being turned into smithereens, and yet he has to continue his job. This is not easy at all. But every time this has happened, journalists went back to work as if life goes on and it's business as usual, although we deep down know this is a different moment. And so our answer is, for as long as we're alive, we shall continue our job as Palestinian journalists. Thank you, Wael. Thank you to the rest of the panelists. Thank you to you all. Thank you.